Hello and good evening, and tonight we are going to be working on Unit 9. Unit 9 has us covering a bunch of different stuff and is actually going to pull in some outside resources, which I don't often do in class, but I did find this really nice little Microsoft tutorial I thought was very useful and some interesting information from their website. And I will tell you that, we've been making really strong progress, I think, through the tutorial document. Last time we did manage to finish up the caching and the Razor units. And I don't know if you caught this, but a couple units back, we also talked about data annotations, and our tutorial document does have a chapter just on that, and they go through and they show like a whole bunch of different data annotations you can use. There are no exercises in that chapter, just a lot of information. And honestly, this is one of the best listings of all the data annotations that I've seen, so I think it's really kind of a nice little resource. So I'm not going to lecture on it. If you really want to be lectured on it, I had recorded a video a couple semesters back that is in whatever unit that's associated with. I think it's Unit 7. So make sure that you get a chance to look at that. The other thing that we should talk about, and it will be very brief here, is to talk about the NuGet package managing component of Visual Studio. Now, what's interesting about this, folks, is we've kind of already been using this like on the fly, and you guys will recall a couple of instances where we added like the entity framework or jQuery, for example, and it really is kind of an essential tool. In fact, I can go ahead and just click on through to it. So if you didn't have the NuGet package manager and you wanted to add something to Visual Studio, you'd kind of be stuck going through steps like the ones that you see here. So basically, whatever it is you're adding, you'd have to find it, download it, unzip it if necessary, maybe even compile it, and then add it to your project somehow, and then probably spend a bunch of time configuring it so it actually works. What NuGet brings to the table is that capability of right inside of Visual Studio being able to add a package, and not only being able to add a package pretty quickly and easily, but have it all set up for you so that it works properly with your project. The only problem that I've seen with NuGet is sometimes it tends to load a lot more stuff than you need. So like if you just want the jQuery libraries, there's no reason why you need all the extensions that they throw in. So one thing that you might want to do in the aftermath is, if you know you're not using certain libraries, is maybe delete the excess things. And some of the tools that they throw in, some of these packages are there just for helping us as developers, as opposed to actually being of any benefit to the user. So for example, if you were using the jQuery libraries, the efficient way to do it is, of course, to use what they call the minified libraries, where all like the extra spaces and long variable names are removed and it's all condensed down and efficient. And you could actually set up your project that way and then go through and remove all the fluff and actually kind of making a more efficient project. Today I'm actually going to be working on my machine with Visual Studio 2017. And the reason is I've been having these consistent blue screen crashes on my other machine, and I really have not had the time to sit and futz with it. And you guys are probably sick of hearing about it by now. But that's just kind of how busy I've been. So I'm going back to my 2017 install on my own personal laptop, which has been rock solid stable with no issues. But the reason I'm doing this right now is, and you know what, I'm going to just go ahead and just open up just whatever I have here. I'm not even sure what it is. Just the last thing that I opened up. And I think these are exercises from the .NET 1 course is probably what it is. But just basically to show you guys the NuGet package manager, and then I wanted to kind of mention a couple of things to you about this. So the general rule of thumb is that you just use the graphical version of the interface, as they show you in the book, to add something. And you can just simply do that by going to your Tools menu and clicking on the option that I have highlighted right now. We also saw that when we were doing database migrations and all those little higher end things, that sometimes you do have to actually revert to the console. And the interesting thing to note is in the old days when we would add packages, they did have the package manager, but you had to do everything command line to get it in. And we've, kind of moved past those days, and thankfully, because it was really easy to screw things up and type the wrong commands and get the wrong versions, and not so clean on the console to fix a lot of it. The other way that you can add a package to a site is to right-click on the project node and choose this particular little option. Now, the other thing that I think that's kind of interesting is this. There, for a short while, and not seeing it now, Microsoft was experimenting with a second package manager. And I forget what they were calling it. I don't think it's in any of your readings or books. But I think last year at this time when we were playing with this in class, they had this secondary package manager out there. It didn't seem to have as many options, and I don't know if it was like experimental at the time. And right now I'm not running Visual Studio 2019, but those of you that are might see that secondary package manager, or maybe they just removed it. My memory tells me that it was also in 2017, so I'm really curious. And I think it was called like Bauer or something that starts with a B, I forget. All right. The other thing that's interesting is, as I was just mentioning, as you add packages in, notice that there is this option here off the right click that says client-side library and manage client-side libraries. So in other words, if you are delivering some of this content out to your client, so for the most classic example would be like Jquery, for example. In that case, you actually can control which libraries you're actually pushing out to the client. So when you actually publish and build your project, you're not necessarily pushing all that extra junk that comes with, like I was mentioning. So just something to note. Just as a really quick little demonstration as to like the type of things that you might typically do. Always, when you go into this interface, always note, which of these tabs you're on. So for example, installed updates are the ones that are actually included in the project. So these two are already included in the project, but anything else that you might want and is downloadable would be available through this interface by browsing and then searching. Ideally, you know what you're going to add. You're not just adding it willy-nilly. Hey, I think I'm going to add whatever. No, you don't want to do that. You really want to kind of research what you're going to do. Most of that comes from experience, but the truth is, you got to know how to do it, and sometimes you're guided by others, or people will recommend certain things. When we play with some of the other stuff later on tonight, we'll find ourselves coming into the package manager. So it's a tool that you kind of need to get to know. I know that when we were working with the Entity Framework, for example, a few chapters back, a few units back, how we had to like downgrade it to 6.2 to make it actually work right. And then, subsequently out online, I saw lots of postings of people saying that they had to do the same thing. So it wasn't anything we were doing wrong. It's just that the framework was not really working right. The entity framework wasn't working right with the project. All right, I'm going to jump back over to the book real quick. So they give you like an example of how to install stuff and how to put it in there. And I think that you guys have had enough experience with that at this point. The licensing screens, adding it in, shows you what it does, shows you that it was successful, and then all of a sudden you have these tools available. And if you look at your folder structure, you notice all the different stuff that gets kind of thrown in. And I want you to notice, interestingly, here in the background, that some of the stuff that is sitting there in this folder might not be stuff that we actually added ourselves. In fact, some of those things get added right when we build the project. So for example, MVC, Razor, web pages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that should give you a little bit of a thought. So if you started with a blank project and you wanted to put in all the MVC stuff that we've been doing, you'd have to come into the package manager and individually add each one of these. And I think that's kind of interesting when you think about it that way. That's part of what this interface does for us. All right. Now that we got that business out of the way, and I think nobody's really too confused about that particular product, particularly since we've utilized it already. You also had the .NET 1 class to kind of teach you about it a little bit, but it's in the materials, so I always feel compelled to kind of talk about it a little bit. All right, let's move on to section number 22, and we are going to look at a really important technology that follows basically the creation of HTML5 and is therefore kind of included in a lot of different types of frameworks for modern web development. And we need to talk about, kind of not only where it comes from, but what it really means to do some of these particular things. Now, they refer to it here in kind of the grand framework of working in a .NET MVC environment, but I want you to understand that Web API is not unique to this framework, but it is really powerful when it is combined with this framework, which is why very often when you see .NET books talking about these topics, Web API is included because it brings something to the mix that normally we can't really do with traditional web development. And it was really kind of like the part of the grand vision of the developers of HTML5 to really leverage up the client-side platform in the browser to allow us to really do more advanced application development so that web applications are really finally becoming like real applications that are native to our operating systems and with some of the things that follow that power. All right, so let's just read what the author has to say here a little bit. And it begins by saying that it's a framework that makes it easy to build HTTP services that reach a broad range of clients, including browsers and mobile devices. And I want you to make no mistake here that a big driving force behind the whole HTML5 thing in the first place was really the fact that mobiles were on the rise and developing quickly, and it became very apparent very quickly that that was going to become the primary surfing platform for most people. So therefore, we needed to create applications that really worked well on mobile devices, but did not have a lot of the infrastructure overhead that traditional applications would. One of the big takeaways from the Web API is the fact that we can build what they call RESTful applications. And I guess we should probably talk about what that even means, right? So here's kind of a simple way. So if you were sitting at home and somebody said, hey, if you're building your Web API RESTful application, what does that mean? So let's, and actually I probably shouldn't have typed tutorial. Yeah, and this is a typical one that comes up when you start searching it. So this is, something that conceptually that's been around for a while. It's not that old. I mean, like some of our concepts that we work with in programming actually go back decades and decades, but this actually only goes back a couple of decades. But it's not really a technology per se, but more of an approach to building things is the kind of the way that I see it. All right, so what they're seeing here, this guy is basically saying it's loosely coupled applications over HTTP, often used in development of web services. REST does not enforce any rule how it should be implemented at a lower level, but a high-level design guidelines leave you to think of your own implementation. All right, doesn't really say very much. But here are the architectural constraints in terms of what this guy envisioned. That there's some sort of an interface that you're working with that's uniform, that there's a client-server aspect to it. So this is intended for applications that do have a server-side component to it. we would have to work within a stateless protocol, and just to explain what that means is HTTP, by its nature, does not maintain a state of your application. So it doesn't really know on its own, without code telling it, that you're even logged into something. Whereas if you're on a Windows machine, by virtue of the fact that you're even using an application, it knows you're logged in. See the difference? So in order for us to create any sort of a state in the application, we have to be able to write code to make that happen. HTTP on its own is not built to do that. It was never intended to be an application delivery platform. But of course, people get clever and work around that. It is cacheable. We learned all about caching, right? So that means that we can store things and then keep them present for a certain amount of time. That it's a layered system, and we can see what he means by layered below. And then there's code on demand, which is optional. So let's go down to the layered system. So it says where you deploy the APIs on a server, store the data on a different server, and authenticate users on a different server. You know what? That happens all the time. Even when you log into Blackboard to be part of this class, you know, I don't know if you guys noticed, but like if you log into your gateway account, right, like through the website, all of a sudden you're logged into email, and all of a sudden you're logged into Blackboard. But if you hit those separately, then you have to log in separately. But that's all handled by a separate machine because they're on distinct servers. So that's kind of what a layered system is. So not that you necessarily have to do it that way, but it allows for that sort of an approach, and I think that's pretty important. All right, the other little tidbit here, it says code on demand, and it says optional. So it says most of the time you'll be sending static representation of the resources in form of XML or JSON. So those are primary mechanisms for moving data. And I'm going to tell you what, when these technologies first came out, it was all XML. And in the last, I don't know, 5 years, JSON has just exploded. And if you guys aren't familiar with that, it's just serialized JavaScript with key value pairs being transmitted. It's really smooth, efficient, and most applications seem these days to prefer using that. All right, but it says when you need to, you're free to return executable code to support part of your application. It says example given, clients may call your API to get a user interface widget rendering code. It is permitted. All right, so if that makes any sense to you, basically what it means is it doesn't execute code unless it needs to execute the code. It just doesn't do it just for the sake of it, right? And notice it's on demand, and that's part of the thing here. And I'm not happy with this guy's explanation. Yeah, and this probably will be better, and of course, way wordier. But let's see if we can just maybe read the first paragraph or so to get an idea here. It says, representational state transfer. It's a software style that defines a set of constraints to be used for creating web services. Web services that conform to the REST architecture are called RESTful web services. They provide interoperability between computer systems on the internet. Okay, interesting. So now if you take that title, representational state transfer, and then you think about going to the gateway website, logging in to my gateway, or whatever you call it on the student end. I think it's my gateway, right? You get that single sign-in screen, and then all of a sudden you can get the Blackboard, you can get the Office, you can get maybe not Office, but you can get to a lot of things as a result of that one login. The reason that that's allowed to happen is because the applications are allowed to talk to each other and transfer the state that they're in, basically meaning signed in this case. And it works across machines and applications and platforms and whatnot. All right, so I think that that's kind of an interesting way to look at it. And then it says, these services allow the requesting systems to access and manipulate textual representations of web resources by using a uniform and predefined set of stateless operations. All right, so we're going to like experiment with this, but you're going to see that when you're working with stuff like this, basically what's going to happen is you're going to create a front-end application that interacts with something on the back end and then allows it to be transported back without necessarily having to move executable code. And who knows what it is you're talking to on the back end to make it happen? Who cares as long as it works? All right. So, and it can get pretty sophisticated depending on the application. The kind of stuff that it can deliver to you is typically going to be delivered in the three formats you see here. So usually HTML, XML, or JSON. And you know, lately, you know, as I was mentioning, JSON seems to be the one that's got the most legs. And the other thing that you see when you're working with RESTful stuff is that you're looking for a resource's URI, which is different than a URL, right? A URL, of course, you can hover here and it just tells you, right? So the web address is basically all that is. A URL is just like where it is on the web. A URI, conversely, notice that it's a string of characters that unambiguously identifies a particular resource, not the address. You catching that? It's not the address, you know, but there is a specific rule set that you follow and a naming scheme that you follow to make sure that it all works correctly, and we'll see that. So, you know, you got to be careful because the reason you have to be careful is this looks kind of like URL, just with the L at the bottom, and that's why they made these uppercase, so that was pretty clear. All right, let's go back to the doc and see what they would like us to do. All right, I'm just going to read these first couple little blurbs here. It says, when you're building APIs on the web, there's several ways you can build API on the web. Okay, that's a little redundant, but these include HTTP RPC. What's an RPC, folks? All right, let me tell you. It's remote procedure call. So what this is telling you is that we have the ability to send a call to do what does a procedure sound like? A method, a function, an application, an executable. Yeah, that's what it is. So we're calling upon something remotely to execute, to bring something back to us to get the work done. And what this means is HTTP in remote procedure call. See, it says it right here. Like methods across the web. The verbs themselves are included in the API, like get customers, insert invoice, delete customers, and each of these endpoints end up being a separate URI, Uniform Resource Indicator. All right, so we're going to go ahead and create a little simple application, and we're first going to follow the tutorial here, and then we're going to complete the Microsoft tutorial, which is similar, but comes at it from a slightly different standpoint. And I think that when you see the two different approaches, it really kind of helps bring a little bit of clarity to what you can do with this. All right, let's go ahead and open up Visual Studio and create a new project. I'm moving this over to screen number 2, as I typically do, although not quite as large as I just made it. I'm going to go ahead and close what I have open right now because I do have a project open, so I do want to start fresh here. I'm going to ace the start page. I'm going to go to the new menu and select project. Now, once again, I am working with Visual Studio 2017, so it's kind of back to the old interface, but you can get to all the same stuff in the new interface too. I was trying it earlier today before I blue screened. I still have yet to figure out that problem. All right. So let's begin by making sure that we're in the C# area, that we're in the web area, and then of course we want to choose ASP.NET web application with a .NET framework, not the core. All right. I don't know if it's indicating the name. It wants us to call it Web API Demo. And I'm going to kind of be cautious here because I was getting some conflicts before. So I'm like putting dashes in mine. You don't have to do that, mind you, but that's what I've been doing. And I'm also going to be saving this on a local repository, although with Visual Studio 2017 I'll probably work with my cloud storage now. So Right, okay. And see, here's like the confusion here. I think I'm gonna go ahead and actually connect to my cloud storage because I've been working on cloud storage on my other machine, not with cloud storage because of all the issues I was having. So I'm going back to using this OneDrive folder. Hopefully this doesn't blue screen, then we know that there's something wrong with OneDrive and not me. All right. I'm not going to create a directory for the solution. I'm going to keep them both in the same folder. We're going to go ahead, select empty, and this time instead of adding folders and core references for MVC, we're adding folders and core references for Web API. We're not worried about authentication or anything at this point. Once you have those selections made, please go ahead and click OK. Now the interesting thing is we are still basically going to follow an MVC approach to building this, and you'll see that as we go. All right, so here's our empty project, and I just wanted to show you, if you look at the folder structure on the right, you'll notice right away that there's still a controllers folder and there's still a models folder. So they still kind of expect us to take that approach. There's also an app data folder that's sitting there, and and in its essence, it still looks a lot like a basic MVC application. First thing that we're going to do is we're going to go to the models folder here, and we're going to right click and we're going to add a model. Excuse me, add a class. Now you're going to notice on my screen, class appears at the bottom. So go ahead and click that. The interface will come up, and they want us to call this employee CS. All right. Once you've made that selection, go ahead and click Add. And if you're keeping track of pages, we just finished the bottom of page 200. We're moving on to step number 7 at the top of page 201. All right. All right, so now we're on to step number 8, I guess, technically. It says add some properties to the employee class using the following code. And if you're remembering, this is exactly the same thing that we did in the previous applications where we had an employee class. So same set of fields, the ID, the name, the joining date, and the age, and then the beautifully simple getters and setters for C#. Nothing all too fancy. All right. Next step is to add a controller. So let's go to the controllers folder and do a right click and choose add and then controller. From here we're going to make a selection we haven't made in the past, and that is we are going to choose a web API controller. We're going to start with an empty one. Go ahead and choose add. And just like a regular MVC application, it's asking us now to name the controller that we're working with. So we're going to say employee controller, as instructed in step number 11. Go ahead and click add. All right, so that basically completes page 202. All right. All right, so it's saying that it's going to open up a file for you with some default actions, and I'm looking at, their using statements on page 202 and seeing how they don't really match up with mine, which is kind of curious. Although some of those are going to come by virtue of the stuff that we're going to add to the file. So let's see if we can kind of trigger this automatically here. There is some code that follows on page 203, actually a fairly significant amount of code. And the first thing that we're going to do is inside the class file here is we are going to set up an array structure here that will hold. Oop, I didn't want the controller. You see what happened to me? It auto-typed for me and did exactly what I didn't want it to do. And employees equals new employee. And remember here, what's interesting about this is we don't have a connection right now to the data model, which is why it's like flagging us. And let's see what it recommends as potential fixes. And the very first potential fix, which is the using statement, is the one that matches up with the missing statement that I saw on the bottom of page 202. So I'm just going to go ahead and select that, and it just adds it in for us. All right. You can see part of the red underline went away. Now you can see I didn't put a semicolon in here because they do want us to add some stuff inside of curly brackets and then close out the statement. So I'm just kind of building that basic structure first. And then I'm going to go ahead and add in the code. And really all we're doing here is we're pre-generating content to display on the web page, kind of like we did before. So there's several instantiations here of new employees, similar to what we did before. And you know what? I could go ahead and format this so it all lays out beautifully, but I'm okay with it just like this, right? I think we're probably all comfortable with it at this point in time. The next thing we need to do is add a couple of additional methods here. So the first method that we're going to add is this one. And it's one simple little statement like that. The book has it spread out over 3-4 lines. I'm just going to leave it like this. But basically, what we're doing here is it says get all employees, and you can see the return statement. It's just going to return the whole object that we just created above. The next one is an action result that will pull back individual employees depending on what their ID is. And so we're going to add that here. And because this has a few more lines, I am going to kind of spread it out a little bit. And they're doing it like this in the book, of course. Whatever takes the most space. Which would not be, by the way I would normally do that. I would try to be kind of conservative on space myself, but that's just how I think, because I just want more on the screen. But that completes the employee controller per what they have on page 203 in the tutorial. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And it's asking us to run this application. And I want you to notice as you run this, we know that the root or the index or whatever is going to probably throw an error like it normally does. Let's, because we haven't created a home controller, right? So let's let it launch. See how long it takes today. For some reason I had this anticipation. All right, so it's giving us this forbidden error. There's nothing wrong here, but we don't have anything to look at is what it's telling us. But what they do want us to do is add this to the URL, API/employees. And then I want you to see, well, it didn't pull back what I had anticipated it would pull back.
I think because you named yours employee, maybe get rid of yes.
Interesting. Okay. Well, the book tells me to type exactly that, but I'll type in, very good, Javier. All right, so Javier, this is one of those spots in the PDF where I'm going to highlight it, and then I'm going to put in a comment. So next time I do this, don't type the S is my note to myself. All right. And now the interesting takeaway from this is what you see on the screen. First of all, an XML file, and if you guys, I don't know what you know about XML as a format, but you can research it a little bit. it's really one of many ways that we can send customized, encoded like data information back to any sort of a client application. You can see that each one of these has a tag structure that looks a lot like HTML, where everything that's opened is closed, everything is properly nested. But the real difference here is the fact that the information that's presented and the tags that are in there are all customized. We created the tags by virtue of the data or the fields that we created inside of our class. And so it puts the data into that format and then delivers it to the browser. Interestingly, web browsers are not built to natively display XML data in a beautiful format. Really what they're waiting for is CSS. So, for example, if I applied CSS to this document, I could format it like a regular HTML document, where we wouldn't see any of the tags, we would just see the resulting output. This is just delivering the data back to the screen, which is really in raw form. So what it's telling us is that each one of these entries here is really equivalent to like a row in a database table, right? Each one of these is an employee, and then that's the name of, you know, the row, basically, if you want to think of it that way. And then each one of these would be columns: age, ID, joining date, and name, and then the data within each one. And that is one way to send the data, you know, back to the browser. Now, if you want to double check and look at just one employee, so this is, once again, we're using the URL to control our application, just in like a regular MVC application. And in this case, we're passing an ID to it. It's going to receive this ID and then pull up the information on just one individual person with that particular ID. And once again, don't type the S.
Mine comes up with the S.
So Brenda says hers comes up with the S. Now I wonder,
Isn't it calling the array?
it should be, you know, I didn't have any notes on this from last time, and I'm just wondering, what did I type that was wrong? So I thought I copy pasted everything.
I think in the controller, the book did say employees with an S, but when you did it, it was just employee, like singular.
Javier, you are right on. He is absolutely correct. Take a look. So if I had an S here, see my pointer?
Oh, you didn't name your controller.
Yeah, I did it. I was wrong. All right. You know, in the way to fix that, of course, is I can just go back and adjust the code. Not really a big deal. You guys okay with me leaving it like this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good.
Now that we know why.
Yeah, now we understand why. All right. So that's a really basic example of this. You know, granted, the way that the data comes back to the browser is not really very impressive, right? So if you're feeding data like this back to an application, this is your mindset, okay? You're pumping it back into a web page framework that's already built. It's got a whole graphical interface and whatever it is that you're doing on your front end. And you're just going to be reading this data in and applying CSS to it like any other data. So you would actually set up CSS that would handle employee, age, ID, joining date, whatever, and then that you can control your user output that way. It doesn't take very much to do, but because these tags that we use in XML are custom, the browser does not natively know what to do with them. But if you add a style sheet in and add a style for those particular tags, so I would just say, if I wanted to apply it to age, for example, I would just say, in my CSS style sheet, I would just put age, right? It's not a class name, it's a tag name, right? So I would list it exactly as it's shown there, and then apply whatever style. Typically, you want to do like display block or display inline just to make it appear, and then put whatever fonts and colors and backgrounds or whatever you want to do, you can do with it. But if you think in terms of an application receiving data and displaying it, that's really what we're doing here, is we're just pulling the data out of the application and sending it back to the screen. What format you deliver it in, that's up to you. All right? That completes the non-Microsoft tutorial in section 22. So if you got this working, section 22 is complete in the document. And I think that given the fact that we just crossed that hurdle, let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and jump over to the Microsoft website. All right, welcome back from break. I'm jumping back over to our unit folder here to point out a couple of things before we move on. The first is in the topics section up at the top, I found a really nice resource here on the ASP.NET website, of course, Microsoft site, talking about Web API. And what's fascinating here is it's really kind of a cool resource. So if you're already familiar with doing, MVC stuff, and then you really want to build RESTful applications, this is really kind of a great little example. One thing that's kind of fascinating here was right on the front page here, they have this like really interesting little snippet of code. And as you guys see, just a really quick little controller, and looks not too different than what we just did, right? They created, some people, and then at a command line, they're issuing a command, and then the return of that command line is what we call serialized data. And I want you to just look at this really quick, because this is like the huge movement right now in web development, and that is pulling back data from an application framework that is serialized. And when we talk about serialized, we're talking most notably the JSON format. If you're not familiar with what that means, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, I believe. And when it sends information back from a data source, whatever that information happens to be, it sends it back in this format. So first of all, it sends back key value pairs. And what's fascinating about that is it includes the name of the field and the data together. Inside of curly brackets, comma separated, and then you see that name is repeated, right? And that seems a little inefficient, but if you compare that to the XML that we were just looking at, right, where they're breaking down like the whole entry and then by field, and there's tags and brackets, and it's really not that inefficient. In fact, it's a lot more efficient when it comes down to it. Because it's in JavaScript, it also makes it a beautiful format for sending information to a browser. The browser loves it, right? Because it's JavaScript, it knows exactly what to do with it. Where with XML, it's not quite as clean and takes a little bit of work to get it to display right. Where here you can actually take things that are coming in as JavaScript and then feed them directly into parts of the DOM, as you're building your page, by just simply populating the content or the inner HTML of it all, so to speak. The kinds of things that you can do are pretty interesting. So they show all these different little examples here. And once again, notice that JSON is kind of like the main format that they're using, and in this particular example, they're just routing traffic via a controller. And I don't know if you guys, I guess I didn't mention this, but you see like this command here is if you're working at a prompt, right? You guys ever heard of curl? And if you've taken advanced PHP, you guys haven't done that class yet? Right, when we do advanced PHP, towards the end of that class, we learn about curl. Curl is just I'm not sure what the acronym stands for, but it's basically a set of commands that you can invoke that allow you to basically pull data from external sources. So for example, you can run curl commands to pull back like the current weather, or the status of a server, or I'm stretching here, but that type of information, and usually from a specified data source. It might be your application, or it could be somebody else's application, and then usually the data that it sends back will typically be some sort of text. It could be serialized data like JSON or XML, or it might just be like a table of information. So like one exercise I remember doing in the advanced PHP class with my students is I'll have them use like the Yahoo stock service, and they can pull down stock quotes directly by we create an interface, you type in the stock symbol, hit the button, it pulls back the current price. And how does that work? Well, there's some server out on the internet that provides that information. That's how all the websites out there are able to do it too. And the reason they do a curl command here is because they're showing you that you can basically hit that URL just like we did in the browser in the previous example, and just pull back the results without actually even launching a browser. It's like if I probe the server, this application, and really what we're doing is we're running this application, the people controller, and the all method, right? And then that's bringing back the information. So the curl command is just a little bit of a shortcut to just simply extract the data from the external source and bring it back. And we didn't really mention that much. But they show you, once again, how to do that. And just great little resource site. There's so much to learn here. I think it's really cool. And Microsoft's gotten a lot better about working with a lot of this stuff. Now, if you go back to our page here, I had located a web API tutorial that Microsoft had put together. And, as I do in my explorations often, sometimes I get really deep into them. If I find something that's really cool that I'd like to share with the class, I do. So I thought this was a really kind of cool little exercise that kind of adds on a little bit to what our book was doing. So if you can go ahead and open up that link. I'm opening it in a new tab. And what we're going to do here is we are going to step through and create this simple little project. It's not really that intense, but it's interesting to kind of get that different take on it. So this is what I'm going to be using as a resource. If you guys can pull that up on your screens as well, and hopefully you're like dual screening like I am, so you can kind of look at both things at the same time. I'm always like trying to like kind of arrange my windows on the other screen here, if you're wondering what I'm doing right now. Just so it's comfortable for me to look at mostly. All right, so the first thing that they want us to do here, and actually let's just read it a little bit. It says, all right, and here's the thing. So let me pull this back over since I got it on screen. They already have a completed version of this project, and while you guys might be tempted to kind of quickly get your grade, please actually go through the tutorial because I think there's a lot to learn here. Of course, I will look for little signatures that indicate that you actually created it as opposed to Microsoft, like the file creation dates and stuff like that. So please don't cheat. But it says in this tutorial you used ASP.NET Web API to create a Web API that returns a list of products. HTTP is not just for serving up web pages, it's also a powerful platform for building APIs that expose services and data. And see, this is the key thing. So the way that we're looking at this information is the application that we're building is a service, and it's providing data on demand, whether it's to a browser or through some other script. So HTTP is simple, flexible, and ubiquitous. Almost any platform that you can think of has an HTTP library. So HTTP services can reach a broad range of clients, including browsers, mobile devices, and traditional desktop applications. So that's another aspect. I guess we often don't think of that as we're building these applications, but one of the reasons why web development is so huge is because so many of the applications that we build, even native to the operating system now, are really feeding in data using the technologies that we've learned. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to do layouts and do front-end work. Hey, it works. Who cares if it's inside of a operating system native window? It doesn't really matter as long as the information gets there. In fact, all the Windows Store apps are really just that. Isn't that interesting? Remember I showed you Visual Studio Blend a while back? And if those watching the video, you didn't see that, you should explore that product because that's a tool for creating applications specifically for that environment with the primary coding languages, of course, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. All right. This API interface, they say, is built on top of the .NET framework, although it's important to note that it is an aspect of HTML5, so you can build it on top of not .NET too. You just have to use other technologies to do it. All right, so what we're going to do here is we're going to create an application that returns a list of products like this. So we're going to actually pull data from the application and get it to display on the screen, and then also put in a little search field so we can pull in specific information. Once again, mostly a demonstration. We're not really worried about like the quality of the presentation at this point. But once you see how this technology works, then it really kind of gives you this ability to build much more sophisticated applications that do have rich user experiences attached to them. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move this off to the other screen now finally. And let's go over to Visual Studio. I'm going to close the work that I was working on before, so I'm going to choose Close Solution. And then we're going to go to New Project. And then we want to go ahead and make sure we choose C#, just like we did before. Web. And then we want to select ASP.NET Web Application with a .NET framework, just like we did in the previous example. They want us to name this Products App. And this time I'm noticing that there's an S in there, just so I don't make the same mistake I did last time. And I am putting that out on my cloud storage. And I'm going to say OK. All right. Next thing they want us to do is choose empty, which is kind of our pattern now. Not MVC, but Web API for folders and core references. We're not worried about authentication or unit testing or any of that stuff. I don't know, did I mention this tool to you guys at all? Is anybody familiar with what Docker is? Yeah, and this is kind of neat because I've been noticing this in a lot more applications lately. Well, Docker is a piece of software that runs on Macintosh platforms that allows Windows applications to operate within it. And so if you enable that box, you could create an application that would run inside of a Docker environment. And so people on, I don't know if it runs on Linux or not, but I assume they probably have a Linux version too. There are other tools that allow you to do the same thing without having to specifically design for it. But this is telling you that that Microsoft is actively working on cross-platform stuff more and more. So I think that's kind of a cool thing. Right, go ahead and say OK to that. It's going to scaffold out our project based on the selections that we've made. Of course. All right, well, that's not good, folks. All right, I'm going to try this again. I'm going to say no. Did anybody else have an error? I'm batting 1,000 on this semester, aren't I? Visual C#, Web, .NET. So I'm going to call it something else because I know I already have products created, so I don't want to mess up the same thing. If I have an issue, I may end up kind of trying a different approach here, so let's just hope that's not the case. And I didn't click anything weird, so let's just hope that this time maybe there's by some magic it'll work. All right, I'm getting this exception again. All right, so what I have to do, folks, is guess what? I have to pause and figure my way around this. So give me a moment, please. All right, apparently the 5th time's the charm. I don't know what I did different, but I tried it several more times and it finally worked. So I'm just going to attribute it to a glitch with Visual Studio. Seems like we're having many of those this semester, so it's kind of interesting. All right, so next step they want us to take is to add a model. So we've kind of already done those steps before, so this should be kind of familiar. So I'm going to go to the Models folder, right-click, choose Add, and then we want to add a class. For the same reason we added a class before, so make sure you choose a class file, name the class Product. Singular, by the way. All right, and then we have our empty class file here. First thing we're going to do is add all the fields. And you're going to see how this is really, really similar like the employee thing that we did before. So an ID, a name, a category, and a price. 2 strings, decimal, and an int. All right. I'm going to go ahead and do a Control S to save. Next thing is to add a controller. Now, remember, the whole role of the controller is to kind of route all the traffic. Remember that. And we're going to go ahead and choose, right-click, choose Add, and then Controller. We're going to add an empty controller, selecting Add, and let's see what they want us to name it, and they want us to name it Products Controller with an S. Select Add. You'll notice now that in the Solution Explorer we do have our product controller file and our product CS file both available. All right. The next thing that they want us to do is start adding stuff to the structure. Now, on the website, which I think is always kind of cool on sites like this, they create these little code windows, and I think they're awesome because, you know, it's all color-coded just like it is in Visual Studio. And you can actually just come in here and copy the whole darn thing, which is fine. So if you want to do it that way, please feel free. I'm going to go ahead and follow the same pattern. However, I'm noticing that there is one little difference. You notice that there's one library here that isn't there. And my gut instinct tells me don't delete the stuff that it added that aren't in the example. But I probably do want to add the product app models tidbit. So I'm going to copy that. I'm just going to add that here. From there, I'm going to make sure that, and see, I have another reason for not copying it because I've named mine a different way, obviously, right? And now we haven't like built these particular objects yet, but I do need to match up names. So here, I call mine Products 3 Demo, and they're calling theirs Products App. So guess what I got to do? First thing I got to do is change that syntax because it has to match up. Otherwise, it won't see it as a library that it will need. So now those two names are matched. So that's one of those things you got to be careful of. Because I struggled so much to create the application, I ended up changing the name of it. And I don't know why I put in demo instead of app, but that's how many times I kept trying it. Probably because I wanted to demolish it at that point. All right, so inside the main class file here, we're going to start to add the rest of the code. So since we're working incrementally, let's just keep working in that fashion. First, I'm going to create an array here of products. called products. We're going to do the same thing that we did in the other application, which is to create a way to return all the products back to the screen. And what type of product are we returning? Well, product, you know, the class that we created up here. Next thing that we're going to do is we're going to get have the ability to get the product list back to the application. So we're just doing get product, pass the ID, and then it'll find it and then put it up on the screen if it is present. And that's all the code, folks. So once you have that, I would do a Control S and save that as well. So that's all it takes to build the controllers and stuff. It's not really that difficult to do. And if you want, let's go ahead and we can actually run this. And then you'll notice that they have a couple of URIs that they're going to point out. So remember, you know, in an MVC application, and I guess maybe we didn't say this enough at the beginning, but the URL that we type into the browser has nothing to do with the actual file and folder structure, right? So we know that already. But the URI is an indicator of how to access it within the application. And that's in essence what we're going to type in the browser. So let's go ahead and launch this and see what it does. Make sure it works, doesn't crash and all that. All right, let me grab the browser from screen number 2. Now, because we don't have an index method, this will of course error out. But what they want us to try first is this: API/products, and it should pull back the list of products. Okay, and once again, it's coming back in HTML format. Excuse me, XML format. And then if we add an ID to the end of the URL, or I, if you want to look at it that way, pick one of the ID numbers, add it to the end of it, press enter, and it should just pull back that one individual product. All right. Once again, controlling the application from the front end. Could we run a curl command to pull back the same data? We could experiment with that, right? Want to try that?
Yeah.
Let's bring up a command prompt and see if we can get it to work. So if you remember, you type curl, and then you type in the URL. I'm just going to copy it. Why not? And paste it. Press enter. And notice how it pulls the data back. Notice because of where we're receiving the information, it's pulling it back in JSON format here, where the browser pulls it back in XML format by default. I think it's fascinating that it's so simple that we can actually use the curl command to pull back data from an application even without running a browser. So now if you think about what that means, is if you're building some other application and you can embed a system command into your application, you can, in essence, do this and pull that data into anything. It doesn't really matter that it's a web application that's feeding you the data. If you can pull that data in and then read it into any piece of software, right? I think that's really cool. For those of you that might be taking or have taken the Python class, at some point in that class, we get to the point where we scrape websites, and this is kind of a similar type of approach. It's really doing the same type of thing. All we're doing is leveraging the website creator's API, which they usually provide the commands for doing so, and then you can pull any data back that you want. So I think that's a fascinating thing to do, and kind of fun, frankly, because it's not that hard. All right, the next part of the tutorial is called Calling the Web API with JavaScript and Jquery. And what we're going to do here is we're actually going to add a page, an HTML page, that's going to allow us to pull that data back and insert it into the page using a technology called AJAX. And you guys should be familiar with that at this point, right? Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. And you know, my standard little spiel on AJAX and the kind of power that it brings us, you know, I always demonstrate, like, if you just bring up your Gmail, and please ignore the messages on the screen, especially if they're from you. No pun intended. But when you look at something like this and you find like some, oh gosh, I'm not sure what message to pull up. Oh, here we go. That seems pretty inane. All right, not that this is bad. I'm sorry if these people end up watching my video. I'm saying that it's inane. But I'm in this interface here where I'm reading email, and what I want you to notice is I'm not actually refreshing the page, folks, right? The interface is there. I'm clicking on a message header, and by virtue of clicking on the message header, it does change the URI, the call to the application, but what it's doing is it's using whatever syntax triggers the right thing to bring back that particular message onto my screen without redrawing the rest of the screen. And that's what AJAX brings to us as a technology, is that ability to send information from a server back to the application, the browser, without refreshing the page. And that is really, really important, that we're not doing an additional send back and forth, running another script. We're just getting the info we need and bringing it back. There's no need to reload the whole interface. And that makes for powerful web applications. All right. Let's go ahead and go back to Visual Studio here. And they want us to right-click the project node. So that's the name of the app here in the Solution Explorer. Give it a right-click, choose Add, and then select New Item. Make sure you select the Web tab here. Make sure you're in C#, and then find HTML page. They want us to name the page like something that we're actually comfortable with. Index.html, hey, why not, right? It's the default.
Where did you find HTML in the list? In the small list?
Oh, where did I find it in the list? I went to Visual C#, and I went to Web, and it was the first listing.
Okay.
Yeah, so maybe you scrolled past it or something. It's too obvious, apparently. All right, so there's our index file. Go ahead and click Add. All right. Now, in the tutorial, they're giving us a complete document. And you know what? I'm going to copy the whole thing in. And once again, I'll bring that back over so you can see, right? They have this like block of code, and you can just hit copy. I do have a little bit of a concern, frankly, about how it's going to call stuff from the application, but you know, I guess I'll find that out as we go. So I might have to change a little bit because of what I named things here, but we'll find out. So I'm just going to copy all this. You can just hit that copy button and then come back to your app, do a Control-A to select all, and a Control-V to paste it all in. So if we just take a look at the code here really quick. So we do have a standard HTML5 page. Notice that because we are application building, and this is kind of one of those things that's kind of weird to learn a little bit, we are still using the XML namespace for XHTML, and the reason for that is when we're application building, we have to make sure that we're strictly following the rules of XML in order for our applications to work, so we can't like use like input tags without closing tags. Like in HTML5, you normally don't need to do this. It's only when you're building an application and you declare the XHTML namespace. But some of the technologies don't work unless you do that, so that's why we're doing that. You have to stick to those strict rules. The other thing, you know, for a format like that, you know, XML basically says that any tag that's open must be closed. And there's plenty of tags that don't have closing tag. So this is kind of weird, like right here. You notice how they have like a UL, but it doesn't have any list items? But yet I'm closing it at the same time, so I'm pre-creating the container for a UL, self-closing it, and then later on, we'll populate the list items dynamically. But in order for that to work right, I have to have a pre-existing UL structure. I could, and have it be completely valid, do that, right? And have it close. But what they're demonstrating here really is that it's not necessary per the XML format that we're building upon. All right, so we are building, okay, there's a title. Apparently we're going to have a list of products here at some point. And then we're also going to have a search by ID with an input box and a button. And then when we click, we'll trigger the find method, wherever that is, or find function. And then we're also going to have a paragraph that we're going to populate with information. Right now it's empty. This is the most efficient way to create something. I do want you to notice that because we're going to be populating these objects with the information, that they do have an ID to make them specific. We don't want to use a class here. It should be an ID. And we're self-closing it just to make it the least amount of code possible on the screen. The other thing I think that's interesting is they are putting in a call to jQuery, but like most good coders, they don't even bother to preload the jQuery libraries. They're just linking out to an implementation somewhere out in the web. In this case, we're getting it from the ASP.NET site. A lot of people tend to link up to Google to do this stuff, but let's just use the one they have because we know it'll work. And then we proceed to our JavaScript, and you notice, you know, they're setting up a variable for a URI, and look at what they're putting in, right? Makes you think they're going to like type in the URL for us, perhaps? Perhaps. All right. And those of you that know jQuery, and have you guys studied jQuery? A little bit in your JavaScript class? All right. So you're familiar. Whenever you're seeing that $ inside of JavaScript code, it implies that we're using the jQuery libraries. And also what typically follows the $ is the CSS selector that identifies the item that we're applying the action to. And then you chain commands off the end of it using periods. So in this case, the document ready function is a function that automatically loads up as the page loads. So you guys should know that about jQuery. So as soon as the document is ready, it brute force runs, notice a function without a name, and it's called an anonymous function. It just runs, right? So we really don't need to name it. Next thing that we're going to do is in here we run this get JSON, and then we throw the URI into it, which is specified up here. And then what it does is it'll read in the items, and notice as it reads the items in, it drops them into a list item and appends it to the ID of product. Now, I'm not expecting you to become a jQuery expert just by looking at this really quick, but it's not too hard to figure it out just by kind of reading through it a little bit. Plus, they have comments all over the place for every little step that they're taking. Right? They're also going to format things by adding a $ in front of them and a colon so that it creates a nice little list. And then we're also putting in a function here that will do find. And then what we'll end up doing is basically finding any object that we've selected based upon the value of the product ID being selected. Really pretty much as simple as that. They do have a couple little conditions in here. So if you get the JSON based on the URI, and if it works, we're going to format it. If it fails, then we're going to put an error message up there. That's basically all that does. Now, it's not an if statement, mind you, right? This is actually a chained series of commands that says, get the JSON, right? Return it to the screen based on this ID. When you're done, format it. If it fails, You know, and there's no if in there, but if it succeeds, it's done. If it fails, it hits fail. Otherwise, fail doesn't trigger. It's a beautifully simple little syntax. It makes for very efficient code. All right, let's go back over to the instructions. So now once we have that, now we actually have to do a little bit of extra work here. So I'm going to move this back over. All right, let's go ahead and make sure all our stuff is saved here. So save that. And then if you want, we actually have enough now to get this up and running. So let's go ahead and just give it a run. We are going to have to bring up in the browser here. So this took us to the index page, right? And you notice it took a moment there for it to load the stuff up. But it did successfully, directly from the page, talk to the server side of my application and load in the data. The reason it's able to do that, folks, if you go back and look at that code, right, is I have the structures pre-created. I mean, that's kind of a no-brainer. And then it will automatically pull that stuff in just based upon the document ready function automatically pulls in this URL just based on this. So if we didn't have this predefined, it wouldn't pull it back. We'd actually have to type in that URL. But what we're saying is the moment the page loads, feed that URI over through JSON and then either pull everything back, right, or don't. Isn't that cool? Yeah, it's not that hard, and you know what? You can use simple examples like this to pull back some pretty powerful data.
The .getJSON is a jQuery method. And we're
Exactly.
looking at the parameter of the variable that we set for URI.
That's exactly right. Right, and Brenda was just pointing out that this is actually just a method that's built inside of jQuery. Notice it is a jQuery command because there's a $sign. There's no selector preceding it, meaning we're not applying it to any particular object, but that method automatically takes the URI that we declared as text. We could have hard-coded it here too, honestly, right? You could just hard-code the text in. But its job is to send that back using that URL, and then when it's done, takes each item that appears, and so this is basically like a for each, and then populates it into this little JSON format here and puts it to our screen. Like I said, this isn't really a tutorial on jQuery and stuff, but it's kind of just a little bit of a refresher on how this stuff works. All right, so getting it just to appear is one thing, right? So when you run it, the list will pop up on the screen. Let's go back to the application. But then if you pick an ID number, so for example, if I type search by ID here and I type in the number 2 as in the example and then hit search, it finds that item in our pre-structured class file because it's got that ID, and it's just putting it back up on the screen. It's a really, really simple thing. The other thing that they point out that I think is fascinating is this. If you go into the developer tools for your browser, and I know that they're doing this on some sort of Microsoft-centric browser, either Explorer or Edge, you can actually take a look at what's happening in the background. So my favorite way to get there is I just click the inspect panel. And you know what? I think I'm just trying to think of the most efficient way. This isn't too bad, I suppose. But if you go to your network tab, right? And actually, why don't you go ahead and just refresh the whole page. And then what I want to show you here is this. And maybe I should move it over to the side. Maybe this will be more effective for us since we have the screen space for it. Let's do it like this. So what this is showing you, this particular tab in the developer tools under network, is how long it took to load up each particular resources. So this index.html, which is resident here on my machine, took 11 milliseconds to load. The jQuery minified file, which is on a remote server, that was almost instant. Do you know why it would be almost instant? Why would something like that, that's out on a remote server, be instantly loaded? And the answer to that is what you think? Because it's cached in the browser already. And I always tell students that whenever you're using the jQuery libraries, use Google's or use, some other like main repository that a gazillion of the other sites you visit already use, and it's already cached on your browser, so that's one less thing that a user has to cache or pull down from your website. Since it's the same set of commands, why not? So it's already loaded. You don't have to worry about it. The next thing that it did is it went ahead and it queried the application, right, and pulled back the information, and that took a total of 25 milliseconds and allowed it to actually pull down the data. The fascinating thing is you can hover over all of these, and then it pulls back detailed information. And I think it's just fascinating when you look at it, because if you hover, I'm trying to get it to appear again, there we go. And if you look at the details of it, so it was queuing for 5.31 milliseconds, stalled for 1.26 milliseconds. The request was sent, that only took 0.2 milliseconds. Waiting, and for 7 seconds, and then the content download only took 2.6. Total 16.62 milliseconds altogether when all was said and told. So I think it's fascinating when you watch the things happen. The other thing is you can come in here and you can actually, actually we can do this other little tip that they have here, which is you can actually notice how this says stop recording network log. So the moment that I switch to this mode, it's actually recording this information. Now, why would somebody even care to do this? Well, because they don't want their users to be frustrated. The total number of milliseconds it took for all this stuff to load isn't really that long, right? But when it starts to get significantly long, it's an issue for the user experience. So, all right, let's actually experiment a little bit, and let's put in some of the ID numbers and do the search. And the point of this now is this. As I do each search, I want you to notice it is not reloading the page, it is not reloading the jQuery library, or the original products, pull down. It's only updating this. And because of that, the interaction time is very, very short. It makes for a really efficient application. The screen is not being redrawn. There's no refreshing going on up here. I think that's really fascinating when you stop thinking about it that way. And I think it's really fascinating that there are people that go in here and test all these things. And I don't know if you guys have ever experimented with any of these tools. So you can break it down by the type of resource, and obviously we don't have a lot of these things going on. But if you have a really complicated website, you can come in here and look at all of it individually. So if you have a lot of images, a lot of JavaScript, a lot of CSS, whatever it is, you can see the detailed time it takes to load a website. You want to do something really fun? tear this off as a separate panel. You can come up here and choose this mode, right? And if you're a dual screen person, throw that up on your second monitor and then go visit some like major websites and watch what happens. I think it's really fascinating. So for example, here I am on the Google website, and you know, I guess if I want to see what's going on there, I have to go into inspect mode here. But you know what, hey, let's try it out and see what the comparisons are. So I'm going to go ahead and just hit refresh on the Google homepage. And are you guys catching how much stuff just loaded? I mean, JavaScript files, CSS files. It's actually kind of amazing how much stuff gets loaded. I think that's pretty mind-boggling. You know, compared to all the code that you guys write for these classes, which is hardly anything. But you know, it's all part of a process. So, I mean, this didn't all happen overnight, but there is quite a bit that goes in there. The fact that you can go category by category here and look at, I mean, so many different aspects of the things that you're pulling in. And it's fascinating. They have something in almost every category here. And this is one of those tools that you use to kind of check the performance of your website and to kind of tune it, frankly, if you're curious. Now, if you want to take it a little bit further, and you know what, I don't think I made this an assignment, but you know, I could maybe make it an extra credit assignment, or if you're just curious. The next step up for this would be to use this web API with what we call the entity framework. So instead of building a pre-built class that has the data embedded in it, we'll be connecting up to a database to make it happen. And you know what, maybe that's a good one to add as an assignment at some point. I'm not really too worried about it right now, so maybe if I remember, I'll add it as extra credit. But I have tried this exercise, and it's pretty cool. Nothing really fancy, once again, but it's enough to kind of get you started. The other thing that we're going to be looking at, not this week, but I think it's next, or maybe the fall, I forget, is this approach for building single-page applications. Those of you that have taken a modern version of the Web Programming 2 class here at Gateway, we've moved to teaching around that format in that class, because that is such a prevalent thing. But if you think about that as just a concept, a single page, having a whole application run on one screen, right? And that's not the approach we use to typically build web pages. Web pages, we think of them as being multiple pages, in fact, dozens or hundreds or thousands of pages even. So this approach of like building everything and putting it on one page is really only made possible by back-end languages and technologies like Ajax that allow us to change our screen without reloading the application. And the real big takeaway here is with this web API thing is that we have kind of an additional MVC style approach that allows us to interact with data, pull stuff back to the screen, but the stuff is coming back to the screen serialized, injected into the page without redrawing the page. And that's really the big takeaway, right? And we consider that kind of a modern approach to doing this. So I would encourage you guys, if you have the time and the curiosity, please go ahead and play with those tutorials. And otherwise, you know, we are basically done with the stuff that I wanted to do here in class tonight. So I'm going to end the video, and then I'm going to open it up to questions or whatever else you guys want to experiment on.